One of the most emotionally evocative words in politics is anarchism. And no matter where you are on the political spectrum, that will probably bring to mind quite a rich range of concepts and ideas, and everyone has an opinion on anarchism. Some people have very strong opinions on anarchism, but what's really lacking, not just in political discourse, but also just the minds of people in general, are some real, genuine facts on what anarchism actually is. How do we take this massive, evocative, controversial, polarizing term and look at it under a microscope? How do we properly examine it and see it for what it really objectively is? So this is part of a series that I'm running on this show, Polymath, called An Objective Guide to Political Ideologies. And basically we take political science and we actually look at these ideologies for what they are. We look at them from an objective, scientific perspective. We consider economics, history, sociology, political theory, political philosophy, and by integrating all these fields, and just to let you know, I'm not just pulling answers out of my arsehole here. I'm taking the various consensus of lots of different fields in lots of different areas, and I'm integrating them all together to present to you factually what this word anarchism actually means. What is the ideology that's actually represented by anarchism? So if you're looking for an answer with no bias, no bullshit, no random hot takes spouted by some twat behind a microphone. I mean, I am a twat behind a microphone, but I'm a more informed twat behind a microphone than some of you other twats. Then, ladies and gentlemen, you've come to the right place. Welcome to Polymath. So I am your host, Daniel Levy. It is lovely to be back. I've been doing a few videos on this channel now about political ideology. So the last one was episode 14, and that was about communism. Again, a very emotionally evocative word where there's often a very vast disconnect between what most people imagine communism to be and what communism actually scientifically is. By the way, when I say scientifically here, I don't mean science as in the hard sciences. There's no chemistry of communism. It's not made of atoms. It's all intangible. But I'm talking from a social science perspective. And social sciences, things like politics, economics, anthropology, sociology, all these things which are genuine scientific disciplines and where we can have some degree of objectivity here, but where these matters ultimately exist in the minds of human beings. And anarchism, again, there's no element for anarchism existing in nature. It's an intangibility in the mind of a human being. So, I'm your host, Daniel Levy. Lovely to be here. I hope you're doing well, whoever's listening. I'm doing very well. I've been getting some new groceries lately, so things are getting pretty crazy up in here. Getting some new shapes of pasta. It's been pretty fucking wild, ladies and gentlemen. But I'm very excited to be doing a video on anarchism. This has been long overdue. I've left quite a big gap between the communism video and the anarchism video. I've been teasing you guys a little bit. I've been just been letting it mellow for a while, but it's time to get back to it. So, without further ado, what is anarchism? Let's get into it. I'm very excited. So, anarchism is a social and political philosophy, and here's the key thing to understand. Anarchism is not anarchy in the way that you understand it. Anarchism does not mean that there's no rules at all, and there's no means of enforcing those rules. It just differs with other philosophies on how those rules are formulated and how those rules are enforced. In anarchism, there's no formal legal institutions for the law, i.e. there's no institution that determines what these rules are. And there's no formal institutions that enforce these rules. There's no police force, there's no judiciary, and the key thing is there is no state. There's no government per se in anarchism. And etymologically, anarchism is just Greek for absence of government, or just without government. Now, more information on how these kind of norms work and how they're enforced later in the video. But the key thing to understand here, though, is that anarchism rejects any formal institutional enforcement of law and order, even though order is still enforced and there are still rules. So in anarchism, if there's no state, that brings us to a very important question. What is a state? And as you can imagine, there's a lot of conversation on what actually is a state. But a really solid definition is one that was actually devised by a man called Max Weber, who's a sociologist living in the 1900s. You may have heard of this guy, Max Weber. He's quite a big name. I mean, he's a big name on academics. Like, he's not like, you know what I mean? He's not like an A-list celebrity. But he's a very important figure. So his full name, Maximilian Karl Emil Weber, which I think is a pretty fucking great name. Like, if you're going to be an influential scholar, that's the name of the kind of gravity that you need. And a way to summarize the definition of a state as per the conceptualization of Max Weber, and this is a definition which is generally accepted by scholars today, is you have a differentiated set of institutions and personnel embodying centrality in the sense that political relations radiate outwards from the center to cover a territorially demarcated area of which it exercises a monopoly of authoritative binding rulemaking backed up by a monopoly of the means of physical violence. What the fuck does any of that mean? It basically means, what is a state? A state is a set of institutions and a set of people working within those institutions, and it covers a certain area, a territorially demarcated area, for example, a country. And in this area, you have a central source of authority. In the UK, for example, this is the government, this is Parliament. And from that center of authority, you have many institutions and many people representing that authority. And as you kind of go down the administrative hierarchy of a country, for example, the United Kingdom, you have smaller and smaller bodies of authority radiating outwards from that center and deriving their authority from that center until you get to very local government, like, for example, constituencies. And the key thing is that within this territorially demarcated area, this state, this form of authority, has two monopolies. One, it has a monopoly of authoritative binding rulemaking. This, for example, is a law. So anarchism is a social and political philosophy which does not do away with some form of binding rulemaking. There are still stuff you can and can't do. Like, you can't just stab someone willy-nilly. But the idea is that in the definition of a state, is it's this body which it has a monopoly of that ability within its borders. And it also, that's all backed up, that's all enforced by a monopoly of force, a monopoly of violence. So you as a private citizen cannot start your own police force and you can't start your own army. The means of physical coercion are monopolized by that state. And anarchism is a social and political philosophy which is fundamentally opposed to that state. And we're going to be going much more into the ethos of that later, but essentially the rationale of anarchism is fundamentally about liberty. It is fundamentally and deeply concerned with human freedoms, and it views any kind of state, any kind of hierarchical central authority as something which circumvents that freedom to an unacceptable degree. Now, anarchism is an ideology. What does that mean? So in this series about an objective guide to political ideologies, the key question here is, how do we define an ideology? And I talk more about this in episode 9 of Polymath. There's lots and lots of discourse about this, as you can imagine. This is a really big question. For the sake of this series, what I've done is I've taken the existing literature about this and I've tried to synthesize it in a concise, clear, and useful way that I feel represents that literature accurately and truthfully and is true to the spirit of it. So I think what it's reasonable to say, and again, this conceptualization of ideology is common in the literature, but it's not the only conceptualization. So I'm not presenting you with a word of law here. I'm presenting you with a distillation of what's out there. An ideology can be thought of as having three components: an economic component, a political component, and a social cultural component. So an ideology is a set of beliefs, a political ideology rather, is a set of beliefs which says something about A, how the economy should work and how it should be run; B, how power works, who gets power, how is it distributed, what can be done with it, what are the limits on it; and C, not social cultural views, so not just views on social issues like feminism or race rights or trans rights, etc., but also fundamental value judgments about what is good in a society. Because the kind of things which, for example, liberalism, socialism, and communism aim for are very different from the kind of things that fascism aims for. The kind of thing that liberalism, capitalist liberalism aims for is very different to the kind of things that communism aims for, etc., etc. So, and again, when we think of a key definition I have to give you first. So in each of these components of ideology, we can think of each of these components as a spectrum. And on that spectrum, an ideology can occupy a certain space on that spectrum. So in the economic component of ideology, we can conceptualize this as this one-dimensional spectrum of economic leftism versus economic rightism. And that's all about to what degree the government, or the people rather, regulate or play a role in that economy. So in economic leftism is generally is a tendency towards a greater regulation of the economy. Economic rightism is greater deregulation of the economy. The far economic right end of that spectrum is complete laissez-faire. It's complete deregulation of the economy. The far economic left end of that spectrum, we're going to explore more, but it's basically there's no markets, there's no private property. All the decisions made about economics are made by groups of individuals determining what would be good for society. And again, that's a very slapdash, simplified definition. We haven't talked a lot about that. We haven't defined many of these key terms, for example, private property. Don't worry, we're going to. This is just a very quick summary. Now, on the political component of an ideology, we have this idea of libertarianism versus authoritarianism. And it's basically the sort of power that government should have over the lives of its citizens and the nature of that power and how it's distributed. So at the far end of that spectrum, we have totalitarianism, which is when all executive power is manifested in one individual or one organization, one party, and they have, although it tends to be one individual, so like Hitler, Stalin, Kim Jong-un, etc., and they have complete power over the lives of everyone in that state. At the far end of libertarianism is actually anarchism. More on that later, but it's basically the exact opposite of that. There is no state to speak of, and no government in the sense of a state to have influence over citizens' lives. When we look at that socio-cultural component, it's a question of that socio-cultural component of ideology. I'm tripping over my words now. I'm just so excited to talk about anarchism. Jesus. Let me slow down a little bit. That socio-cultural component can be conceptualized as a spectrum of progressivism versus conservatism. Progressivism versus conservatism, different stances on issues like feminism, abortion, divorce, euthanasia, etc., but also value judgments. At the far end of the conservative spectrum, you have fascism. At the far end of the progressive spectrum, you have anarchism. More on what all of that later actually means. But the idea is that in anarchism, the ultimate aim of society is to allow the flourishing of the individual. So at the far progressive end, the values espoused, the values which are ultimately emphasized are those of liberty, individualism, freedom, and equality. At the far right end, at the far conservative end of that spectrum, we can see that the values being emphasized are authority, tradition, duty, order, and hierarchy. So again, it's really about, I've used anarchism and fascism as examples, but it's really about the values that are prevalent within a society. Now, I used the term right-wing just a few seconds ago, and that's because when we look at what left-wing and right-wing, what these terms actually mean, again, leftism and rightism, I've done an episode of it in Polymath, it's episode 8, and there's also, again, a massive political discourse on this, but I've taken that discourse, I've distilled it into a useful definition that captures that literature, and I've adapted explanations in the literature which are agreed upon by scholars. So again, I'm not pulling these definitions out of my arsehole, they're essentially just sort of simplifications of that literature. We can think of this one-dimensional axis of left-wing versus right-wing as having three separate components: the economic component, the political component, and the socio-cultural component. And those are the exact same components and axes that I would just mention with ideologies. So leftism is associated with economic leftism, progressivism and libertarianism. Rightism is associated with economic rightism, conservatism, and authoritarianism. And I say associated because when we talk about these terms left-wing and right-wing in modern Western parlance, that tends to be what we think of. But remember, those three components do not necessarily have to be bound together. So for example, fascism is hyper-authoritarianism. I can't speak. It's hyper-authoritarian, it's hyper-conservative, but it's not far economic right. In fact, it's actually fairly economically leftist. And more on the economics of fascism is something called state capitalism. I talk about that in episode 10 of Polymath. But anyway, the point is that those don't necessarily have to occur together. It's just that in colloquial speech, that tends to be what we refer to in a Western context. So what is anarchism? Anarchism, it's an umbrella term. It's an ideology, but it can occupy various different spaces on these three spectra, these three continua. But in terms of the libertarian authoritarian axis, anarchism as an umbrella occupies the furthest left spot. In terms of the progressive conservative axis, anarchism occupies the furthest left spot. In terms of the economic axis, there's a bit more spread because there are some still quite left-wing but slightly less left-wing than the furthest end of that pole variants of anarchism. But generally on that pole of on that spectrum of economic leftism versus economic anarchism, anarchism is occupying the leftmost pole and the generally fairly left areas. But again, there's more variation in that economic component, but there's also lots of variation, lots of different schools of thought in anarchism in general. Now, the point is, umbrella term, lots of different flavors, lots of different hybridizations of stuff like anarcho-collectivism, anarcho-syndicalism, anarcho-primitivism, etc., etc., etc. Now, within this kind of massive umbrella, there's a divide between schools of thought grouped together as social anarchism. and that includes anarcho-collectivism, anarcho-syndicalism, and anarcho-communism. I'm begging you, I know this is a monumentally difficult task, just pretend as if you'd never heard the word communism before, because I promise you that phrase anarcho-communism is almost definitely not what you're thinking of when you hear the word communism. Now, if you have happened to watch episode 14 of Polymath, and you know you've seen that episode on communism, which specifically you probably wouldn't have, but if you have, well done, slap on the back and a friendly kiss on the forehead, then brilliant, you will be more informed. But just for now, I'm going to get more into that big word communism later. Just ignore your preconceptions of that, I promise. So you have these schools of thought, social anarchism, and also something called mutualism, which are kind of the main school, which are kind of the main umbrella terms. You have this umbrella term, social anarchism, consisting of these three big schools of thought: anarcho-communism, anarcho-collectivism, anarcho-syndicalism. You also have mutualism. These are the main schools of thought of anarchism. Anarcho-syndicalism is arguably more of a tactic for reaching anarchism than a goal. So people who would identify as anarcho-syndicalist tend to say, my goal, the end goal of society that I conceptualize is aligned with that of either an anarcho-communist or an anarcho-collectivist. There's also another umbrella term of anarchism called individualist anarchism, where it's basically just a lot more emphasis on the primacy of the individual. But the biggest ones are anarcho-communism, anarcho-collectivism, anarcho-syndicalism, and mutualism. And what we're going to be doing in this episode is we're going to be looking at the commonalities between all these. We're going to be looking at all the kind of things that underlay both these big terms and all the various other traditions of anarchism, which I haven't named explicitly. And therefore we can kind of capture the gist of anarchism without getting into the nitty-gritty of each and every one, because then we'll be here for hours. And this is already going to be a big episode. And although I hate to sacrifice that depth, I do think that it's acceptable, because I believe that even if we don't go into every tradition, you can still get a very solid idea of what anarchism actually is. You can still understand anarchism as a concept without researching each of these traditions individually. But if you want to, by all means, go ahead. Now, the key to anarchism fundamentally is this hyper-libertarian nature. And the name anarchism, which is actually originally a pejorative, applied surprisingly by Marxists, but more on that later. The name comes from the idea that the state needs to be abolished. You see, communists, the whole point of Polymath is that each episode should be comprehensible and completely understandable individually. I really, really recommend watching the communism episode though. But the idea is that a communist, and again, communism, very, very massive difference between what was done in the name of communism in the 20th century and the practices upheld by the 20th century communist states, and the theory of communism that emerged mostly in Western Europe in the 1800s, in the 19th century. The two are wildly different. I don't know of any political philosophy which has such a massive divergence between what it was meant to be and what was done in its name. But the theory of communism, as devised in the 1800s, would that be eventually you'd create a truly free and equal society where everyone would be able to truly self-actualize as an individual. Genuinely, everyone would be equal to each other. Everyone would be free to do whatever they wanted. And eventually, within this context, the idea of a state would simply wither away. There would be no need for any kind of coercive set of institutions to underpin society. So it would simply just die of its own accord. That is what communists, and again, communism, massive umbrella term, but this is the basic kind of theory of communism, is that the state would wither away over time. But the state would be used initially during a communist revolution, or during the period of the transition to communism. The state machinery would originally be used to help create a society which could then facilitate the gradual withering away of the state. Anarchists reject that. Anarchists believe that the state needs to be abolished because they fundamentally reject any form of hierarchy and any form of coercion, and the state embodies both. The idea is that instead of a state, there's not chaos. There's still institutions that govern society and create some kind of rules for society. But the idea is that instead of a state, you have lots and lots of institutions. And these institutions would be voluntary associations. You wouldn't be coerced to join any of them. They'd all be entirely democratic. These institutions could be labor unions, for example, so trade unions. There could be workers' cooperatives. A workers' cooperative is a business where the workers manage it themselves and they all get a share of the profits. It could be anything. It could be communes. It could be, it could just be some kind of ad hoc political unit. So, for example, if you look at the USSR, that stands for Union of Socialist Soviet Republics. A Soviet is just a workers' council. It's just a kind of group of workers who manage the way that they work and who manage the way that they govern themselves. And again, all this talk about workers, you might be thinking like, so is everyone working class in this scenario? The idea is that capitalism, as a consequence of the nature of capitalism, divides society between, or at least would eventually divide society between a very, very narrow elite who holds all the power and a much larger group of people who work but who don't hold real political and economic power and who aren't genuinely free. So when anarchists talk about workers' councils or workers' unions, the idea is that this would be, think of it as people's councils or people's unions. Those words aren't used. They don't say people, but the idea is that these institutions would be representative of the people as a whole. Now, that actually hasn't happened. So actually, as modernity has progressed, the middle class has gotten wider and wider and wider. But that was the kind of idea behind the anarchist philosophy. And it's the idea behind Marxist philosophy as well. That's kind of the rationale, this kind of idea of the workers representing the people here that we see in anarchism. And the idea is that all these institutions, they'd be associated with each other, they'd be in contact with each other to help kind of run this decentralized this decentralized political polity, but there wouldn't be a central authority. There wouldn't be anybody above these horizontal equal units, all kind of arranged to cooperate with each other, but never to coerce each other, but tell each other what to do. So each of these horizontal democratic voluntary associations would be autonomous. They roughly do their own thing. They might cooperate to set a kind of general aim, for example, foreign policy and national defense, etc., but they all work individually and they all are fundamentally democratic. Anarchism is all about liberty. It is all about each individual being free to do what they like, not to do what they like in a social sense. You can't just go around killing people and attacking people, but you can think how you like. You're not subject to any coercion or repression from a state. Now remember, if you're living in a Western liberal democracy, you are living in a very, very rare anomaly in time and space. Most of the world nowadays, and basically the entire world for the entirety of history, has involved people living under wildly oppressive states. I mean, I'll give just a random example that popped into my head now. In dynasties of China, so in the Ming and Qing dynasties of China, you'd be required to wear a certain kind of haircut to show submission to the ruling dynasty. And if you didn't wear that certain kind of haircut, you would be castrated, your barber would be castrated, all of your sons would be castrated, and your family would be exiled. The idea is that in anarchism, there's no state to tell you what to do. You still have social rules that you have to abide by, but the idea is that even in the states in Western liberal democracies are still fundamentally about coercion. You obey the state because you have to. They're still fundamentally about hierarchies. There are hierarchies within the state. There are executives. There are bureaucrats in bureaucratic hierarchies. There are police forces and police hierarchies. And also, anarchism rejects centralization. This kind of source of authority which ranks higher than you and which can tell you what to do. Anarchism is all about freedom, equality, and individualism. That's not me throwing some kind of agenda at you. It's not me saying what wishful thinking. It's not saying what I wish anarchism is. That is the goal of anarchists. The whole point of anarchism is to create a society wherein individuals can flourish as individuals and not be impeded by the need to work as wage slaves or to put money in someone else's pockets while you just survive paycheck to paycheck. The idea is that you're not reliant on having to pay rent to a landlord simply to secure the basic lease of life. The idea is that in anarchism, you create a society where all the basic goods needed for your survival are presented to you. They're given to you. There's no form of coercion, either political or economic, and that lack of any form of coercion in society. So for example, if you have to work for a boss for a shitty wage just to survive, that is coercion, and you are not truly free because you have to do that in order to survive. And if you have to do that for your whole life, that's not a very great life. The idea in anarchism is that that form of coercion is not conducive to human happiness and therefore needs to be done away with. That is a very, very broad outline of anarchism. Let's get a little bit more into it. Let's sort of delve into it a little bit more, right?